During World War II, the Japanese military engaged in levels of depravity that shocked the world. In the secretive laboratories of Unit 731, helpless victims were injected with animal blood and subjected to surgery without anesthesia. In Nanking, soldiers engaged in a 6-week massacre, murdering civilians with a level of sadism that targeted even children and infants. The human cost was staggering. By the time the war ended, an estimated 30 million civilians had died under the control of the Japanese Empire. Look at this image. These are Russian prisoners of war recovering in a Japanese hospital ward. 30 years earlier, during the Russo-Japanese War, Japan was praised globally for its humanity and its strict adherence to international law. During the First World War, German prisoners held in Japan were treated with similar respect. They were allowed to form football clubs, put on theatrical performances, and were even granted weekly excursions into local towns. Western observers were clear in their assessment, describing the Japanese military as one of the most considerate and chivalrous armies in the world. The nation, once celebrated for its restraint, had become an empire defined completely by slaughter. In just 3 decades, the character of the entire military had been transformed. Despite its rapid industrialization and military victories over European powers, Japan found that the West still viewed it as a junior partner and a racial inferior. At the end of World War I, Japan proposed a racial equality clause at the Versailles peace talks to ensure all nations were treated as equals. The dominant European powers firmly rejected the proposal. 2 years later, the Washington Naval Treaty further codified this hierarchy. It restricted the size of the Japanese Navy to just 60. The final insult came from the United States with the Immigration Act of 1924, which effectively banned Japanese citizens from entering the country. These repeated rejections convinced many in Japan that peaceful international cooperation was a rigged system, creating a deep well of nationalistic resentment that domestic extremists were ready to exploit. This diplomatic anger turned to desperation when the global economy collapsed. Between 1927 and 1929, Japan was hit by a series of bank failures, followed by the Great Depression, causing economic output to fall by 18%. As poverty and unemployment soared, the fragile civilian government reacted with force. They passed the Peace Preservation Law to criminalize political dissent and arrest anyone deemed a threat to the established order. With faith in liberal democracy crumbling, the public retreated toward traditional martial values. They looked back to the samurai and the code of Bushido, which glorified self-sacrifice and the use of violence for a higher cause. This cultural shift centered on the emperor, who was revered as a divine figure and a direct descendant of the sun goddess. His military uniform symbolized a new national ideology. Expansion into Asia was no longer just a policy. It was a sacred mission. The combination of extreme economic suffering and a return to violent traditions left the population ready to accept radical military leadership. The catalyst for the final collapse of the state was the Manchurian Army, a specialized wing of the military that began acting as if it were its own sovereign power. In 1928, officers from this faction assassinated a powerful Manchurian warlord to create regional chaos, explicitly ignoring orders from the civilian government in Tokyo. When the prime minister attempted to prosecute the soldiers involved, he was forced to resign by conservative elites who feared looking weak. The military had successfully called the government's bluff. In 1931, the Manchurian Army staged a false flag explosion on a railway line to justify a full-scale invasion of Chinese territory, once again acting without authorization. When civilian politicians tried to rein them in, the military responded with terror. Over the next few years, rogue factions assassinated multiple prime ministers and launched failed coups that went largely unpunished. The military had learned that violence and insubordination were rewarded. By 1932, the civilian government had been paralyzed and the democratic era was over. By the mid-1930s, the slow-moving coup was complete. Japan was now a military dictatorship where generals, not politicians, held absolute power. The men who had led the rogue operations in Manchuria had risen to the very top. By 1941, veterans of that radical faction occupied the offices of the Prime Minister and the Minister of War. These leaders committed the nation to a total war for Asian dominance, beginning with a full-scale invasion of China and the surprise attack on the United States at Pearl Harbor. The extreme culture of the Manchurian army, its ruthlessness and its disregard for human life, became the official policy of the empire. This specific faction oversaw the worst horrors of the war, from Unit 731 to the Nanking Massacre. The atrocities committed across Asia were the final result of this internal collapse. By failing to check a radicalized military faction in its early stages, the Japanese public had lost their state to its most violent elements.